Hey guys, it's Chandler, and welcome to the Healing Heroes.
I promise you.
I'm Chandler Stroud, an executive, wife, and busy mom of two, who after years of living with anxiety, health struggles, and an unshakable feeling like I should be happier, made a profound discovery that changed everything. Join me on a journey where unexpected paths lead to healing and more happiness. On this show, we'll explore unconventional ways to unlock more joy in your own life with the help of my very own healers and trusted advisors, the Healing Heroes. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. And today I am so excited to have Lizzie back with us from Austin, Texas. And if you missed our first episode together on all things spirituality and the role spirituality can play in your life during difficult or distressing times, I highly recommend you go back and watch it. It was one of my favorites, and I think it was just a deeply meaningful conversation that anyone can get something from or take something from. So thank you for that, Lizzie. And I am so thrilled to have you back, where today we're going to continue that conversation, but anchoring it more in this theme of connection and community and the role that these connections can play for anyone embarking on any sort of spiritual journey or path. And I, for one, will say that when I rediscovered my spirituality middle to end of last year, the connections and the community weren't really a part of my thought process at the time. It was such an individual and internal, intimate experience. Yeah. But now I can say almost a year later how much that community and those connections have meant and played a role in my own healing journey. I mean, so many new friends I've met through going to the Come As You Are service on Sundays, or one of my favorite things and communities that I've discovered as part of going to church again is what we call the holding dinners, which the first week of every month, a bunch of ladies get together and we do potluck dinner and just meet and talk, and we do a mini service. And it's just been so great and meaningful to meet so many other women in my community of all ages and backgrounds coming together to just support one another and have these meaningful conversations. And I can honestly say that was never something that I intended to find when I returned to the church, but it has been so meaningful for me and so unexpected. And I just hope everyone else can experience some of those connections and communities within their own local neighborhoods, or however they decide to engage in spiritual practices where they live, work, etc. So anyway, just wanted to share that anecdote because it has been so meaningful for me. And I am just so grateful to all of the people I've met since going back to the church and rediscovering, and as I said in the first episode, redefining my religious practices these last, 9 months plus. So with that, I'm excited to have Lizzie back today to go a level deeper as we think about connection and community and the benefits of finding those things in your spiritual practice. Before we do, though, I do want to give a quick refresher on Lizzie's background for anyone who's new here today or missed our first episode together. Lizzie has lived all over the world, with her boots now rooted in Austin, Texas, where she's living her dream as the founder of Jubilee Episcopal Church. She is passionate about evangelism for a God who makes each of us for joy, which is why you might see her doing silly dances and talking about church history on Instagram or TikTok with her 60,000 followers. Lizzie is a second-generation clergywoman, and she delights in talking about motherhood, pregnancy, and reproductive justice from this lens of faith and leadership in the church, and brought a passion for intersectional feminism and queer theology to her studies at Duke Divinity School. Lizzie, thank you so much for being back with us today. I am so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. Oh, it's such a treasure to be with you. And gosh, you always make me feel so good. Thank you.
Well, you're awesome. So thank you for being with us and sharing your wisdom. I just had so much fun during our first conversation together. So I am especially pumped to have you back for this one and to talk about something so meaningful for so many. I think a lot of people seek that connection and community when they, whether church, synagogue, however they worship or however they engage in spiritual practice. I do think community and connection is a big piece of that. And I'm excited we get to focus on that today and talk a little bit more about that with everybody. So, Lizzie, in our first episode together, we did talk about this at the top of our conversation, but I'd love to bring this back for listeners to just re-ground us and create the foundation for the conversation today. So I would love to hear your perspective on what spirituality is and how you think it differs from religion.
Yeah. So this is, and I think I said something to this effect in the first episode, it's kind of an unfolding and live question. But the place that I've most come to with this is spirituality is this kind of innate sense that all of us, I really believe, are born with a sense of God or the divine or something bigger than ourselves. And that is actually the fact that we're born with it is something. I became a mom 2.5 years ago, and I had been a hospice chaplain. And so I had seen very much at the end of life people who had no real cognitive function left, who didn't know their name, who didn't recognize their children, who still seemed to have this like divine sense of peace as they were entering the sort of twilight years or days of their life. And then to see that sort of in its infancy, literally in a newborn who just has such a sense of wonder and bigness of the world, I really was like, oh, we're really born knowing God. I mean, that's the language I use. I invite all of your listeners to use the language that is meaningful to them. But as a Christian and as an Episcopal priest, I'm going to speak from my context because it's the context I can authentically speak to. So that's like the spirituality is sort of this organic, fluid, natural thing. And religion is a structure, and there's lots of different religions throughout all of history and time. But speaking specifically to Christianity and my training and background in sociology, religion is the structure by which we can not only start to express this sort of innate sense of who God is and how we connect with God, and structure that gives us patterns and places and ways to pray, because sometimes, I sort of think it's not a perfect metaphor, but like if you're born with sort of a natural athletic talent or natural athleticism, learning a sport, you learn discipline, you learn how to play with a team, you learn how to hone those skills, you learn how to develop those skills, you learn from people who know how to do this and have been doing it a lot longer than you have and who can draw out the best in you. And I think at its best, certainly knowing there's been lots of exploitation and versions of religion that are not its best, but at its best, religious community, religious practice, religious institutions are like that. They're a place where you connect with community, you connect with other people, some of whom are like-minded, and certainly in Christianity, many of whom are not. Jesus says over and over to love your enemies, and I think sometimes we think that's some sort of far-off thing when more often than not, your enemy might be the person on the church committee you're with who drives you up the freaking wall. Right? Or the parents of that kid who was mean to your kid in Sunday school, right? Or whatever. But religious communities at their best are a place where we learn how to do this as a team sport, where we learn from each other, we grow together, and we reach out to serve this world that God has made.
I mean, I think that is the best analogy. I have never heard that analogy drawn before, but that is so perfectly articulated.
Thank you. It just came to me kind of just, I feel like I've heard that somewhere before, but yeah.
I love this concept of bringing out the best in the player, in the person. I think that's so cool. I love that. We're going to have to use that one again because it really brings to life the visual of the role that these communities can play in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. At their best, right? And like, I am the first to acknowledge that there are lots of religious institutions and communities that have been predatory, that have been cruel, that have been toxic. Just like if you've ever been on a sports team and you're like, oh, this is not it. This is not the energy.
Totally.
Right. But I ultimately have faith in the best of God and the best of us. And that's what keeps me both spiritual and religious.
Can I ask, why do you believe community is so important in maintaining and deepening one's spirituality? What are some of the key benefits people might experience?
Yeah. So I'll start what I would call theological and move to practical. So theology just literally means in Latin, talk about God. So it's kind of a shorthand for like, here's the woo-woo spiritual la 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 stuff.
I'm here for all of that, by the way.
Thank you.
The woo-woo la 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 la. Yep, I'm in.
Me too, girlfriend. Me too. But theologically speaking, speaking as a Christian, I actually really deeply believe, and this is a very ancient, old, traditional way of thinking about Christianity that I don't often hear talked about quite so explicitly. But the way to be a Christian is not to do so in isolation. We in the Bible, in the life of faith, in church services, talk a lot about being the body of Christ. And there's a lot of things we mean when we say that. But one of the things we mean is that our individual bodies and our souls and bodies are connected. We are somatic beings, right? What we think and what we do is not divorced from how we physically see, smell, touch, taste, interact with the world.
Amen.
Right? That's like so much of what you're doing with this podcast. And so our individual bodies together form a body. And we talk about this like in other spaces, like the whole audience, the way we sort of somatically link up to people when we are watching a movie together, right? You go in a movie theater and it's a really emotional movie and there's lots of people crying and you may not know the person 3 seats over from you, but you're having this shared emotional experience. Well, that in a religious space and specifically in a Christian space is us saying we together, our individual bodies, make up the body of Christ. And that also means that in our diversity, in our difference, in our different life experiences, in the different way our bodies look, in our different ages, and also to get really like theological about it, our experiences and bodies across time. So all of our ancestors and all of the people who will come after us in the communion of saints, we are connected into this greater body and this greater community. And there's so much that means. But one thing that I think is really important for me is it helps me be a little bit less self-absorbed in that, sure, sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so selfish or whatever. And, it's nice to remember that there are other people who have other problems. But I think the bigger temptation is I sometimes think I have to fix it all myself. Or when we are in grief, and this is a thing that I see a lot, it's very tempting because it's such a lonely and terrible thing to lose someone or to have a horrible diagnosis or to be in a deep depressive episode. We're very tempted to think I am the only person ever who has felt this way, because in that moment you feel alone. You feel like you're the only person who's ever been through that. But actually, you're not. And you're never alone. You're never alone in what you're suffering because God is with you, but also you're never alone in what you're suffering because millions of people are also suffering with that right now and have suffered with it before. And that's what we hear when we go to church, or if you go to temple or synagogue, wherever, you hear stories, ancient sacred stories. And part of why these stories were preserved and passed down is not because every single person in the Bible is a great person. In fact, many of them are like super reprehensible, gross people. But, we're like in lectionary preaching right now, which is like the sort of season of stories we're hearing in church. There's all these stories about David in the Old Testament, and David can be a great guy. He sucks sometimes.
I mean, thanks for your honesty.
Yeah. David, Bathsheba. Yeah. Ooh, rough story, to put it lightly. And so we hear these stories to remind us, like, one, other people have messed up and still been worthy of love and dignity and belonging. And other people have messed up and still found reconciliation and forgiveness with God. And other people have suffered. And this is how they made sense of it. And you are not alone. And here is maybe not a blueprint, like an exact map to follow, but here's a companion to walk with you in this journey. And so that's why I think, sort of to move to the practical sociological piece of this, communities, there's this like ancient ancestral community we tap into, but there's also the reality of people in the community in which you live who you might never encounter in the grocery store because they're not in the same socioeconomic bracket as you. Maybe they can't shop at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or, whatever grocery store you shop at. Maybe they're on food stamps at Walmart, but they too have lost a child, or they too are living with cancer, or they too are just really unsure of what their place is in the world. And church is a place where you can encounter someone who you would never in your social life encounter and find really deep, profound connection with, and you can offer that deep, profound connection too. And you're also bound together in this mystical, beautiful experience of sharing the body of Christ, which is very intimate and kind of scandalous if you think about it. And that's, I think, a little bit on purpose because God is intimate and a little bit scandalous.
I mean, I think that's spot on. And we hear that you are the body of Christ and Sundays if you go to church. And I think it's really interesting how you think about it across time too. I think that's a dimension that isn't often spoken about, but really resonates.
I'm a big fan of keeping church weird. You know what I mean? I think sometimes
I support that. That should be your new motto.
Thank you. Put it on a bumper sticker. Keep church weird. Seriously, I think there's so much stuff that I learned in Divinity school, which is pastor school, that I've learned by reading the mystics and the saints and these super wacky medieval women who loved God and wrote about God. And I read them and I'm like, this is incredible. And then I think sometimes the church as an institution is very tempted to sanitize those stories because we don't want to scare people or we think they're too strange. And I don't know, I'm out here living a life where I'm like, yeah, it's not too strange. Parenting a toddler makes everything seem less strange.
Yeah, I think that's right. Strange and unpredictable and messy sometimes.
So messy.
It's not all so perfect and rigid, and sometimes there's chaos.
Yeah. And I think every single person at some point, maybe once a day, maybe once a week, maybe once in their lifetime, has this moment of, am I crazy? This is just so wild. There's no template for this. This feels so strange. And if we don't give ourselves permission to name the sort of wildness of our spiritual lives in religious spaces, then religious spaces are not allowing the fullness of our wild and enormous and unimaginable God to express God's self, nor are they allowing us to fully tap into all that we can be as spiritual beings.
I agree. I think that's really important to keep in mind. So Lizzie, I think what you said is really important. And I do feel like I think a lot of listeners probably imagine these spiritual gatherings as perhaps obvious places to connect and find community with like-minded people who maybe possess similar beliefs or backgrounds as it relates to spiritual practice and religion. But are there ways spirituality, you think, help people from different backgrounds or belief systems celebrate their differences in a way that fosters a deeper connection and sense of community?
Yes. Yes. I mean, in my heart and hope and in my experience, that is the best of what church is and the best of what spiritual communities do. And as we're in another election year, I think it's very clear, actually, that churches are and religious spaces are some of the last places in a deeply embittered and divided country where people who vote differently still break bread together, who are not bound by blood. And that is something that I really cannot overstate the importance of that because... And obviously every church, right, there are certainly churches that skew one way or the other. My church tends to be pretty progressive, being as colorful and loud as we are in Austin, Texas. But that doesn't mean that everybody there is like-minded on the same things. And it doesn't mean that we all get along exactly beautifully. And instead, what church, I think at our best does is teaches us how to disagree with dignity and how to be in community inevitably when we don't all see eye to eye, because we're just not. I mean, the whole reason that God made each and every one of us in our diversity and difference is because God cherishes and celebrates that. And I think that church, in my experience, is the only place, the only social institution, and I think you could say this of any religious institution, but again, just speaking from my context, where people truly from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different ethnicities, different cultural experiences, who would never cross at a school track meet who would never necessarily interact in the same social spaces, at the same, line outside the DMV office, right? Like all the different sort of places where people interact. Church is like the one place where people who would never necessarily socially meet each other can become family to one another. And that's really, really powerful. And the intergenerational care that I see. So my daughter's 2.5, and I am really blessed that when my husband and I had her, a lot of people in our family moved to Austin to be with us, which feels like an exceptional blessing in this day and age.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, to have 3 of her 6 grandparents in this area is like enormous. It's an enormous blessing. It's how I'm able to do as much as I'm able to do. But even so, like, she also has like other grandmas and other aunties and uncles at church, people who have known her whole life, who care about her, who care about her well-being, who are going to make us food when the second baby arrives to welcome this baby and welcome us. I mean, that is, I don't get that from my like fitness club, right? Like that level of care and teaching. I think the church at our best says like, look, it doesn't matter if you don't get along with so-and-so on your committee, or it doesn't matter. We got to show up for each other when we're suffering, and we got to take care of each other in very practical ways of like showing up with food, and also in deeply practical and spiritual ways, like praying for each other. And I think also, if you are in a space where you really feel like, wow, this kind of feels like an echo chamber, like this religious spiritual community, I'm not feeling pushed, I would invite you to dive in a little deeper. Because one of the challenges of faith communities, of spiritual communities, of religious communities, and I want to be careful to not sound like I'm uplifting like toxic behavior or predatory behavior or anything like that. But when a community is doing this right, when we are following God, when we are loving each other, loving our neighbors and our enemies as ourselves, it is not always going to be comfortable. You're going to encounter people who really push your buttons, with whom you really disagree, whose buttons you're pushing, whom you are challenging. And the task of that is to lean into it, not to say, oh, nope, I can't do that, right? Because if anywhere can learn to handle conflict, I would hope it would be a place where we all are one body. And one body doesn't necessarily mean all of one mind. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 says, the eye cannot say to the foot, I have no need of you. And what I think the Apostle Paul is getting at there is like every part of the body matters. And we also have different functions and different ways of being. And also, it's like I can't remember what body part. I always get this mixed up, but it's like the hand cannot say to the ear or the nose cannot say to the ear, I'm not an ear. And if the nose was the ear, then what would hearing be? Or what would smelling be? Right? Like we all have our differences is important. And that's part of what it means to be a body together. And to get really woo-woo with it. So in Christianity, we believe in this thing called the Holy Trinity. So God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And many of my like non-Christian friends from other faith traditions, when we sit down and when I'm not pregnant or having a margarita, they're like, okay, all right, Lizzie, with the greatest respect, what the heck does that mean? It's like not 3 gods, 1 God, but what is this? And I'm like, yeah, that's super fair. First of all, that's a super fair question. It's really weird. Again, keep church weird. But one of the things that I love about this belief in the Trinity is that it actually says God in God's self is diversity, that God in God's self is community, that God doesn't need us. God just needs God. God is complete in God's self. God desires us. God makes us for joy. And so when we look to the ultimate source of power, the ultimate source, which is God, we see 3 distinct persons in perfect unity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we as human beings are never going to have that perfect unity, but we can let it lead us into striving for the best that is possible. So does that answer your question? Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think it is helpful. And I think you brought up some really good points about how there are ways. I think you took how to celebrate differences and flipped it on its head in a very new and different way, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I think if I could just add, celebrating difference does not mean, and this is where this gets really hard, right? Yeah. It's like loving all people does not mean tolerating all behaviors.
I think that's really important to specifically call out.
Yeah.
Because I do think people mix that up sometimes.
Oh, yeah. And so loving all people does not mean that you can walk into a church space and spew harassment or spew hate speech and then say, well, these are just my beliefs. No, this is a place of love. And this is a place of care for the most vulnerable. And that is where there is a gift when wielded correctly in religious institutions, having certain structures and hierarchies of power. So I, as the priest, can come in, and certainly in situations, I mean, I've not had to do this, but like in situations of abuse, I have the authority to say, no, this person cannot have oversight over you. Or we have to do a criminal background check on every single person who wants to volunteer with children, right? That is an expression of authority used appropriately and used with responsibility. But it's also an expression of authority if you have people who, even if it's not necessarily like one of the big hot button social issues, just someone who's being mean to someone else. Like, the gift of church is that there's grace and there's forgiveness, but there is also accountability, which I also think in lots of other places there just isn't, because we're afraid of getting sued or, whatever, right?
Yep.
Like, and the church, there is some latitude, and that's, the best and the worst of us, but I do believe in the best and hope for the best.
Well, I think that's a really good point, right? Like, differences in the way of approaching those differences and educating or talking about them if it comes from a place of love versus hate. And I think it's an important distinction because a lot of people, like I said, I think kind of lump those two things in together, and they are not one and the same. Not. And I think that's really important. But I love the role of authority and how, in a religious community like that, you may have more leeway to protect those who are vulnerable versus what you might see day to day out in the world.
Yeah.
I love that. Lizzie, how can individuals balance their personal spiritual practices with communal activities?
So I think you need both. I mean, and sort of coming back to the beginning, again, speaking from my context, I need to break bread. And when I say that, I'm talking about communion or the Lord's Supper or Eucharist. We use different words for it in different expressions of Christianity, but in the Episcopal Church, we typically call it Eucharist, which is this meal of remembrance and this meal where the real presence of Christ is with us and consecrated bread and wine. And we share, sometimes it's kind of funny to call it a meal because it's like one bite of bread and one sip of wine. But
a meal for all.
A meal for all. And actually, there's certainly in our church, we do real loaves of bread that our bread bakers build. They don't build the bread, they make whatever.
Yum.
It's wonderful. And I will say I have to give out really big pieces. So it really is like a hearty snack.
You don't need those donuts before church.
And so it's this meal. I need to break that bread. I remember when my daughter was in the hospital when she was 6 months old with RSV. She was in the hospital for a week. We came home. And church was still meeting in my living room at that point. And I looked at my husband. I was like, okay, so we've got to put some like respiratory disease safety protocols in place. People can't meet in our house. We need to be outside and masked for at least the next few weeks as this RSV outbreak moves through. But I still need to have communion. And I still need to partake in this holy feast. And I still need to show my people, because this is what I need as a mom. And this is what I need as a person, is I need to stand around the table and remember that I am also nourished. And that Jesus also feeds me, especially at that point. The part of the story I don't often tell is my daughter was in the hospital with RSV, and I was in the hospital at the same time with mastitis, and was like having to bounce back and forth between her room and my room. And I was like, I need to be fed from the body of my mother, from my Savior. I need to remember I'm not the sole caregiver here. And so that's where I think the community meets the individual need, right? And I see this, like I think the best view in the house on a Sunday morning. I get to look out at all of these beautiful people who come to church, and I see a million different stories on a million different faces. It's like I see people who are just really happy to be there, having a great time. And I see people who are really stressed, and I see people who are really searching. And I see that sometimes all in the span of 2 minutes in the same face. I see I see that all of that, and that's the gift, is that you can bring the fullness of who you are individually to this corporate, this body space held together. But I also think if you have to have your own personal seeking and nourishment from God to come into that space, right? And that's what helps when there's toxic behavior in the church. So church does not replace therapy. Church does not replace all the other modalities of healing, a lot of which you're talking about on this podcast. Church is a part of it. Religious spaces, sacred spaces, spiritual spaces are a part of it. But like, sometimes you've got to go like do some really painful staring in your soul mirror and let God love you. Let God love you, but also let God love you by being like, all right, boo-boo, it's time you and me figure this out.
Oh, Lizzie, I've been there. I've really been there. And I love that you're saying that, because I do think it's such an important piece of the overall healing journey. But even as you said at the beginning of our conversation, we have to get comfortable sitting in discomfort. Mm-hmm. We've got to sit in those uncomfortable conversations to move through. Yeah. We've got to sit in whatever pain we're feeling emotionally, even physically at times, to have it move through. And that's the only way to get on the other side of it. Otherwise, you carry it with you and it affects how you show up every day. And so I love that you're saying that.
Yeah, and affects other people. I mean, that's like a big thing I see as a priest, because church stuff is just managing group dynamics left, right, and center. And that's the gift of it, is we can be a space where, as you are not a fully healed person, you can still exist and we can have grace for you, right? I have been the not fully healed person who's been kind of a hot emotional mess, right? And church is a place where we also, at our best, say, we see that you have not fully moved through this, and you have your own work to do that we're going to love you and support you through. And also you have that work to do here, and how you learn to manage that and not take it out on other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really important. And I will say, I think the impact of finding my own spiritual community was so much greater having come at it from an individual standpoint first, doing the work and really thinking about, how do I feel about this? How do I feel about the things that have happened? Getting in there cognitively and somatically trying to process them so that spiritually I could figure out the role of that in my life. And once I had a better sense of my own spiritual identity, that's when I could really engage and lean into the community that was presented to me and create those deeper connections. Yeah. And that's been so powerful. But I do think it is a balance between figuring out what that means for yourself and who you are from a spiritual lens before even maybe being able to find those deeper connections. They'll always be there, but kind of what you take or get from them and are able to give back is such a function of how you feel about yourself.
Yes. Yes.
You touched on this actually as part of your previous answer, but I'm curious what role you think rituals and ceremonies play in fostering this deeper sense of connection with others that we've been speaking about.
I mean, that's kind of like, for me, the heartbeat of a communal connection. Like, even if you show up for worship in a spiritual space and you arrive, our church service starts at 9:30. You show up at 9:32 and you leave right at the end of the service. You don't talk to anybody else, which I have been that person. If you need a priest to give you permission, be that person. Like, we're just glad you're here. When I have been deep in religious trauma spaces, I was like, it was a huge deal for me to go to church, and I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't stay there, but and I needed a space where that was okay. So even quote unquote, if that's quote unquote all you're doing, right? You're not someone who's super involved and knows everybody. You are still a body who is a part of the body of Christ in this really like special and particular way and place. And so for me, I think there are very few corporate, and by that I don't mean like corporate America, I mean like many people in one place experiences where we're all invited into this emotional connection and release. I mean, I think that's part of honestly why Taylor Swift and the Eras Tour is like such a cultural zeitgeist moment, because it's like people talk about the energy and how special it is and how safe they feel, and they make these friendship bracelets and they exchange them, and her show is so great, right? And I think church at its best is, I mean, at its best it's the Eras Tour. No,
Are you telling me I can catch the Eras Tour on Sunday at my local church? Because I'm in.
I mean, kind of.
I hear where you're going with this, though, and I like it. I do. I like it because I know the feeling that you're referencing.
Yeah, here. It's like you're surrounded by strangers, and you're like, also, we all are sharing this thing. We're sharing this experience. Yeah. And like in this moment, there's like such a profound sense of unity, and unity doesn't mean conformity. Unity means, well, we're all sharing this and sharing it beautifully. And I will say the difference in church is that you don't have to spend, $300 for a ticket. Right.
Or way more in the case of Eras Tour.
Oh my gosh. I know. It's
crazy.
I dreamed of going, and then I was like, yeah, never mind. I have to pay a mortgage. But, there is this like equitable access, right? And there is something really powerful to, not only can we all be having the same joyful experience, or even all the same cathartic and sad experience, like at a funeral, you can also all be having different emotional experiences, but you're all here in the same room. Like actually often happens at a funeral. People have very different ways of grieving. I have had some of my biggest, belliest laughs right before funerals that were in my family for devastating things. And I'm not laughing at the circumstance. It's just my body needed a release, and I'm with my family, and it's this weird thing because we're like, this person is dead and we're all here together in our nicest clothes that don't really fit. And like, this is just weird. It's just a weird experience. And it's also beautiful and emotional, and your body and your soul and your spirit is just going to process that in a million different ways, in ways that you can't always hang on to in that moment, right? And so what I think a communal spiritual space, and speaking of church, does is it offers a place for that to be okay, and for you to just be held in it. And I see that also in the ways that religious communities offer these sort of touchstone or milestone moments. So in the Episcopal Church, we have baptism. There are some people who get baptized as babies, some people who are baptized when they choose it for themselves. And if they were baptized as babies, they can be confirmed, which is a really powerful sacramental experience where you say, we really think baptism is about God choosing us, and God offers it to everyone. And confirmation is saying, I say yes, like this is my yes, my yes to God, and also my yes to this particular community and all of its messiness. And that's really cool because the community then bears witness. And we have this thing called the baptismal covenant, where we ask a series of questions to the parents and the godparents of the person being baptized, basically like sort of are you ready for this? You can't be fully ready for it, but as ready as you can be. And then we turn to the community and we say, will you do all in your power to uphold this child? We do this in weddings too. I just did a wedding this weekend, and my favorite part of the wedding liturgy is we start and say, after the vow, or after the declaration of intent or consent, we turn to the congregation and say, are you going to do all in your power to uphold this couple in the vows that they make this day? Which is a recognition that nothing happens in isolation, right? Everything is actually community connected. Even if there's like clearly two primary actors, the people being married and then the people around them. But it's also kind of a powerful moment as a priest to look out at the in-laws and be like, are you going to support this? Are you going to get on board with this totally new structure and dimension in your family? And they say, we will. And I just think that's really powerful and binds us and bonds us in ways that we can't even fully articulate. And so like, Chandler, I don't want to like put you on the spot, but you were confirmed a few weeks ago. And that was quite a thing for you. Please, would you share?
It was. I'm happy to share. It was deeply meaningful for me because, as I had mentioned at the top in our first episode, I was baptized, confirmed, and married all at my local Episcopalian church. But growing up, I went because I was kind of told to. It was a little bit more out of obligation. And in the last year, I have really, again, kind of rediscovered my spiritual practices and redefined them in big ways and made them more relevant and tangible to my life today. And by doing that, they've become more meaningful to me. And I've really made a push to understand what it's all about.
Yeah.
And that has been a huge part of my journey, my healing journey. And so I was really excited. I had signed up as part of, again, going to church as an individual, trying to re-examine my spirituality as a singular person. I found this unexpected community. And in that, I felt motivated to sign up for this Bible study class called Catechumenate, which prepares you for confirmation. And I took it, met a bunch of other women, people in my community, and I said, I think I'm at a point where this means something entirely different than it did when I was a kid. And I want to acknowledge that and I want to affirm that. And so the confirmation, I just was confirmed. I reaffirmed my confirmation vows 2-3 weeks ago now. And it was so meaningful. And it felt so special to be there amongst not only the other candidates who were there with me, some from the class, others 13 years old, which was just funny. It was like me and a couple other adults in the class of teenagers.
Intergenerational connections.
There's it was so funny. It was funny at one point because we had to write our names on the cards and the older women were like, what are our pronouns? I'm sorry. And so there was a lot of educating that was happening between these teenagers and these older women. And it was so cool to see that firsthand.
Yes.
It was really wild. And so there was the community there. And then the community of the church was packed with families and loved ones who came to support these candidates. And my mom came, which was really cool. And it was just a really special day. So I was really glad I did it. And it just felt so different than the first time. Mm-hmm. So very meaningful and very anchored in this sense of a deeper connection with a faith community and a community that I am growing every day, and I'm just so grateful to have in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's the tweet right there. That's the whole, everything you just described is even squeezing that story into the words that you just had isn't the full sum of it. And yet in sharing that, it's these fractals of this beautiful, full picture. It's just beautiful. It's just beautiful to see human beings being humans connected with each other.
Yeah, it really is. And, I think figuring out your own kind of your spiritual basis and how you want to engage in spiritual practice, it's such an intimate and individual thing at times, especially if you're healing from trauma, loss, grief, anything, any sort of distressing experience you may have had in your past. But I really found a way to come to terms with what had happened to me in my youth. And I feel like the spiritual perspective of that and seeing my life now and everything I've been given, everything I've learned from that experience, the person I've become from that experience, the ways it could have gone so much worse, it really made me realize, and I'm not saying this is for everyone, but for me, it was a very powerful moment when I realized that all of that had happened for me and not to me. And that simple understanding has completely transformed how I go about my life every day. I have, a new sense of trust in God and the universe, which in practical terms has immensely helped my anxiety. Wow. And my day-to-day, my need for control. I can relinquish control so much more because I feel like he's on my side. And it's just been really powerful the more I've used that muscle. And so that would be my plug for anyone looking for this type of community or considering it. I think it does take that moment of curiosity to drop within yourself and understand how you're feeling and what you need to process or come to terms with, and how spiritual practices can help you and support you in that. And for me, it was so meaningful. And then, of course, the community layer on top of that has just been a bonus that I was not anticipating.
Yeah.
I'm curious, given this conversation, Lizzie, how has community influenced your own personal spiritual journey?
How is it not? When I was in seminary, so I had to get 2 degrees to be a priest. Well, technically 3 because I had to have a bachelor's too, but which is a whole long other story. But it was a really long road, and I was tired of basically having to prove my faithfulness, and that was starting to make me jaded and mad. And I was in a class very close to the finish line of like graduating, getting ordained. And I was working also full time in a church at this point because it'd been a long process. And I had this professor look me and everyone else in the eye. He wasn't talking to me specifically, but it felt like it, where he was like, you are going to meet lay people, meaning people who are not ordained, people who are not like professional Christians like I am, who know God better than you do, who are more faithful than you, who have faced harder things than you have, and are showing up more than you are. And you need to accept that as a spiritual leader, not because you suck, but because that is the reality of like following God. And you need to let those people also lead you. Having this fancy degree, being a dedicated person who is ordained, who is, this like chosen leader, doesn't make you better. It doesn't make you a spiritually better person than the people you were serving. In fact, more often than not, they are going to teach you. And the task is for you to keep remembering that, even as you have to be the captain of the ship, right? You have to be the one to sometimes make difficult decisions, and you've got to make sure the lights stay on, et cetera, et cetera. And you're the one who's up there preaching and leading Bible studies and praying for people, as they're dying. And that is just so true. I did a funeral a few weeks ago for a parishioner whom I just loved so much. And she died of brain cancer. She has 2 kids. I mean, it's just everything about this was so cruel. I mean, it's just one of the cruelest.
I'm so sorry, Lizzie. That's so hard.
It really is. Honestly, like it's one of the most painful losses I've had as a priest. And I think sometimes people don't fully, and it's not their job to realize this, but like we grieve when our people die too. Like we really grieve. And she was so dear to me, and she was so faithful. And so like I read this text in the homily I preached, where she texted me one day, and I was like 7 months postpartum, which was not a great chapter in my emotional, mental, physical health.
I mean, for anyone.
Yeah. Because at that point, it's like the shiny newness is worn off and you just haven't slept in 7 months.
Yep, totally.
Yeah. And she was like, I know that there's probably no one thanking you right now for how much you are doing to pack lunches or feed your baby or clean the house, but I physically can't do that anymore. And I want you to know that I see it and I thank you. And someday you're going to be thanking yourself for this. And like, I just remember falling to the floor and sobbing reading that text, which was a parishioner, someone who I was spiritually caring for, just like seeing straight into my soul, it felt like, and offering this, incredible wisdom as she was moving to the end of her time in life, which she knew. I mean, she knew she had cancer. And so that is how community has shaped and formed me. And I never would have met her if I hadn't been her priest assigned to the church that she worshiped at. But her story, her faith kept me faithful in moments where I didn't feel like being faithful. And I have seen that over and over and over. And it is the enormous privilege of my life as a priest to sit with people and bear witness to their most beautiful joys and also their deepest pains, and to hear how they have survived and how they've seen God at work. And I mean, Chandler, you're one of those people. Like, sharing this and doing this healing work is really moving to me. And I hope you know that as a priest, but also to all the priests who care for you in Connecticut and all the clergy you've ever known, because we do this for y'all, and y'all also keep us doing it. You keep us faithful.
Thanks for that, Lizzie. That's really special, and I appreciate you saying that. I really do. I can't imagine how hard your job is. I mean, truly, I really can't. It's so much celebration and joy, but so much of the other side of that coin. And it's true. I think we do forget that you guys are people too. You're grieving the loss a lot of times right alongside your parishioners, and not only having to experience that for yourself, but also hold up that community. And it's a lot. So I mean, I very much appreciate you, and I'm sure there are thousands more who do down in Texas and all over the world who follow you and see your work and are just so grateful for it. So thank you.
Thank you. It's hard, but it's also so beautiful. And I love what I do. I don't know what else I would do. And
I don't either, because you're so good at it. You can't do anything else.
Thank you. There's also
you're a lifer.
Oh my God. Thank you. There's also a lot of joy in it. And there's also a lot of like funny little quirks. You know, I mean, I do have donuts every Sunday. So there's a lot of work perks.
So do we. A lot of work perks. Coffee is real good at church. Extra good. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Lizzie. I think that's so important. What advice would you give to someone looking to deepen their spiritual connection through community?
Okay. So I'm going to assume this is someone who's not regularly participating in a spiritual community. Is that?
Let's make that a fair assumption. Okay. You should answer the question from the perspective of someone who is not engaging in a community today.
I commend it. I commend a community to you. And here's why. I mean, if I know people who are so traumatized from certain church experiences that stepping into a community is triggering for them. So I'm not saying that you need to put yourself in a place that is going to do you psychological harm. And if you are in a place where you're like, well, that feels uncomfortable, which is different than psychological harm. Let's just be very clear, right? That feels like scary. That feels like kind of a new thing. Like I may not know anybody there. I would challenge you to try. And there are a few practical tips and a few spiritual tips. So practically, it really matters to me, obviously, that communities be LGBTQ affirming, and not just sort of passively affirming, but deeply committed to that. And any church that is affirming of women in ministry and affirming of LGBTQ folks should say so on their website. I mean, this is the digital age. So pull up Google Maps, see what churches or spiritual communities are around you, and check out their websites. Have mercy on them if their websites look like they were made in 1995, because they probably were. I will say internally, I'm working on it. I'm trying to convince my people to do better, but just have a little mercy and don't be afraid to check it out. And honestly, if you see, I will pull a plug for the home team, the Episcopal Church. If you see an Episcopal Church and you send an email to the priest, which is probably called rector or vicar, the head, person in charge, say, hey, I'm kind of curious, but I'm nervous. Can you tell me what to expect? Or can you have someone there who will sit with me? We would love to do that for you. I will share at Jubilee, my team of people, my lay team, we are on the lookout every Sunday for new folks. And we try not to overwhelm and be like, oh my God, you're new. We're so excited, right? We try to have some chill, but we're excited. And we have a little gift to welcome people. We have these handmade candles that a friend of ours makes. They smell incredible because she's a sommelier. She was actually Beyonce's sommelier. I'm getting down in rabbit holes here. I know.
Amazing. I will. I mean, I'm coming either way, but I will definitely look for a candle.
Yeah, they're so great. But we're so excited to have you. And I get emails like this all the time of people being like, I'm really curious. And I'm happy to meet with people before to answer any questions. And also I've really worked hard on our website so that it tries to sort of lay out what can you expect. Lots and lots of churches are live streaming their worship now. So you can even just watch the whole service from home and just sort of scope it out. That's sort of the practical pieces. But I think the biggest thing is just make the leap and give it a chance, right? As the person who is writing the sermons every week and standing up in the pulpit, not every sermon is a 10 out of 10. Not every Sunday goes off without a hitch. But trust your good.
I'm going to say yours are, Lizzie.
Oh God, I promise you they're not. I promise you they are not. That's really sweet of you to say, but I will be the first to say, look, some of them are better than others. And that's just part of it. That's just part of the creative life. And and also sometimes you just connect more with other texts. But anyway.
Like Moana.
Yes. We were listening to Moana this morning and I thought of you. I was like, this is perfect. Yeah.
Oh, so good.
But just give it a try and be open-minded and open-hearted to it. And if it's new and different, not new and toxic, right? New and different, that's okay. Let that teach you, let that lead you. And see what unfolds, because even if you just try a place out a couple times, that might open up new doors for you. And it's also kind of like finding a therapist. Sometimes you have to try one church and be like, okay, this wasn't for me, back to the drawing board. True. But like, don't be daunted, and there's all sorts of reasons for that, because churches are also places full of people. Okay, this is from Parker J. Palmer. I did not come up with this. When the going gets tough, turn to wonder. So instead of saying like, ugh, that's just so whatever, it's like, I wonder why I'm having this reaction. I wonder why this is making me feel this way. Or I wonder what my reaction can teach me about myself, which I think is a great spiritual practice for like lots and lots and lots of things. But especially when you're having a new experience, it's like totally a normal human thing to project our discomfort onto the new thing and say it's the new thing's fault, instead of saying, maybe this is just me experiencing something new and that's uncomfortable.
I love that. I think that's really practical advice, and I would co-sign that as well. And I think, that's what a lot of women, especially who are really busy and worrying so much about everyone else around them, it can be really hard to do that audit for themselves and say, wait, no, really, what am I feeling? Like, yes, I'm feeling stressed because there's a lot to do, but beneath that, what am I feeling and what's causing it? Like, that can be so hard. And I know it can be hard because I couldn't do it for so many years until I really got curious and focused and purposeful on what I was trying to do and used all of these tools to get me there. But I think it's a really important reminder for people, because when you do identify or unearth what that thing is, you can address it. And once you address it, it's so empowering and it's so freeing. I love that. Well, that's great advice, Lizzie. Thank you so much again for the time today, for speaking with me, for sharing your experiences and your wisdom with our listeners. I just love our conversations, and I truly could sit here and just talk to you all day, but I know you have a million things to do, so I won't do that to you.
Oh, thank you. This has been such a joy. And I really meant what I said. Like, you keep me faithful. So thank you. Thank you for pursuing this project and inviting me to be a part of it.
Well, thank you for that. And right back at you. You keep me faithful as well. And to those listening, if you were moved by today's conversation, please share it with friends and don't forget to subscribe. You can also visit healingheroespodcast.com to get resources, meet the heroes, and share your ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening, everyone. And until next time, remember, be curious, be courageous, and be kind to yourself. You've got this.